Okay, yeah, so should I kill the movie? Oh. Yeah, I was trying to get the movie to play again. Anyway, sorry. There's lots more movies to come. Yeah, so my work uses high-resolution ocean models to understand, in particular, the ocean circulation around Antarctica and how that ocean circulation is changing and how changes, how changes in the ocean circulation and ocean temperature around Antarctica will impact melting of the Antarctic ice sheet and thereby global sea level. So by trying to improve our understanding of this ocean circulation, the main aim of my work is to then reduce the uncertainties on projections of sea level. So one thing that this visualization shows well here, so this is output from a global ocean model simulation showing surface velocities. And so you can quite clearly see here all the eddying motion, all those little swirls in the ocean circulation. And so part of what I'm going to explain to you in my talk today is why those are so important for climate. They actually impact the mean state of the ocean circulation and climate, not just the variability. Yep. Okay, so for those of you who don't know much about climate modeling, I'm going to start with a really simple representation of what an ocean model is. So we have, at the surface, the models I'm talking about today are sort of ocean sea ice models, so they're not fully coupled climate models. So we take observations from the atmosphere, including precipitation, winds, humidity, shortwave, longwave, heat fluxes. We take river runoff from land and then melting and calving from the Antarctic ice sheet and from Greenland. And these are all our surface inputs to the ocean model. Okay, so we then use physics equations in the interior, so conservation of momentum and mass, to solve for the velocities in the interior, considering all the different forces acting on the water in the interior. We then move our heat and salt around in the interior, which then we get a new density structure in the ocean, and then we repeat this process over and over again in time. So I guess one of the big considerations when we're developing an ocean model configuration is what resolution to use. So this is our grid box size here. So typical climate models that are used by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change for our climate model projections that the governments depend on are at this 1 degree resolution over here. So this is about 100 kilometers across a grid box at the equator. And you can see in the ocean at 1 degree, you miss out on all of this eddying motion that we saw in the last video. But I guess depending on the science that you're trying to get out of the ocean model simulation, so if you're running on the kind of timescales that the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change is interested in, then you're really limited to only running at this resolution because you need to run for multiple hundreds of years, which are climate relevant timescales. So a lot of my work, we run on much shorter timescales, sort of decadal timescales. And so for that, it's feasibly possible to run at these sort of eddying resolutions on the left here. So another important part of climate models that there's, even once you get to this eddying resolution here, there's still a whole suite of processes that we still can't resolve. So some of these are mixing. So if you have two different layers of density in the ocean, the mixing of these two layers, which occurs by turbulence down to scales of, down to centimeter scales. So there's no way we're going to be able to include these even as we get to these really high resolutions on circulation type scales. And so we need to come up with parameterizations, so simple equations that describe the physics, the impact of these smaller scale processes to include those in our larger models. Okay, so a bit more about why it's important that we resolve eddies. So I guess I could say, so those models that don't resolve eddies like those on the right here, so they'll also have parameterizations for eddies, so to try to include the impact of eddies on those larger scales, but those parameterizations are lacking quite a lot. Okay, so what do eddies do? So they move heat and salt and nutrients around the ocean. And this is actually fundamentally important, so it changes the density structure of the ocean and thereby changes the large-scale circulation and our heat and carbon uptake. So to explain a little bit more about how that works, so on the left here is a very simplified picture of the ocean. So here we have the South Pole, the North Pole, the deep ocean, and the surface. And so we have these layers in the ocean, so these deep, dense layers that don't interact much with the atmosphere. They can be thousands of years old. And then at the surface, we have lighter density waters that interact quite a lot with the atmosphere, more on sort of century timescales. And so what eddies do, so eddies are generated, it's a particular type of instability that are generated by taking out potential energy from the ocean and converting it into kinetic energy. So you can see there's dense waters here up at the surface, and sort of relatively lighter waters here that are down lower relative to these waters over here. And so what eddies can do is to rearrange this density structure of the ocean, thereby reducing the potential energy. And so you might end up with a configuration that looks more like this when you resolve eddies properly with a thinner surface layer here. And if we look at the climate models, the whole range of international climate models across the world, and compare models that look more like this to more like this, we find that models that have this thinner upper layer of the ocean have a lot less capacity for taking up carbon and heat, because most of the carbon and heat that the ocean is now taking up is stored sort of in the upper kilometre or so over the ocean in this upper layer. And so processes like eddies that will reduce the thickness of this layer at the surface have a huge impact on our projections of what's going to happen to the world under climate change over the next century. So it's essential that we represent these processes well in our models through parameterizations or resolving their effects. Okay, so what resolution do we need to resolve these eddies? So the eddies depend on the impact of the rotation on the circulation, which varies largely with latitude. So you need less resolution at the equator and higher resolution at the poles, and some smaller effects depending on the local ocean stratification. And so if we're looking at sort of a 10th degree or 12th degree there, we can resolve eddies across most of the ocean at that resolution. At these higher latitudes, you're going to need much higher resolution, getting up to sort of a 40th, 50th degree. Okay, so what does this mean in terms of how expensive our simulations end up being to run? So the sort of workhorse model, high resolution global model that we use in Australia is 1/10 of a degree resolution. So it's mostly eddy resolving across most of the world. So this is 3,600 by 800 grid points. We use 75 depth levels. This requires, for numerical stability, a time step of around 600 seconds. And for climate studies, we need sort of at least 10 to 50 years for something interesting to happen when we perturb the model. So getting up to sort of a million time steps or so. So that's kind of justification of why we need to run these things on supercomputers. And this is just to show, so this is a small regional simulation in the Southern Ocean. This is Australia here, Antarctica. This is zooming onto the Kerguelen Plateau. This simulation was thanks to the NCI VisLab and some other scientists who ran the simulations. And so what this is showing, this is on the outside here, you're seeing a 1/20th degree simulation, so much higher than the one I was just talking about. And in the center here, you're seeing a 1/80th degree simulation. And so you can see that even as you move beyond this eddying length scale, there's smaller and smaller processes that are being resolved as you go to these higher and higher resolutions. So as we get more computing power, we can include more and more in our ocean models every step along the way. Okay, so I just wanted to talk a little bit about how we develop ocean model configurations in Australia. So we have what we call COSIMA, which is the Consortium for Ocean Sea Ice Modelling in Australia. This is what COSIMA looked like 10 years ago. This was the annual meeting in 2012. I'm very happy to say that over the last 10 years, we've come a long way. So both in terms of size and also slowly increasing diversity as well. And this large expansion of the ocean modelling community in Australia was largely due to a quite small ARC linkage project. We're our second one of those now. And this linkage project, it only funds two people, so one software engineer and one researcher. But we've had this huge additional buy-in from the community and a lot of people, students, postdocs, people across a bunch of different universities, across CSIRO, Bureau of Meteorology, contributing to our ocean model development, using the output from these models, and so on. This one. Okay, so some of the things that we do as a community, we have shared model code and configs, and we develop these together across 5 or so universities and the government institutions. We also run simulations together. So as a community, we decide what type of simulations we'd like to run, and when we run those simulations, we talk to everyone within the community to see what different output people would like so that we can make the best use of those simulations. We also share model output. This is rather small compared to the astrophysics community that we heard about before, but still large for us. We also share analysis scripts, so we have an annual hackathon amongst all these people where we work on our Jupyter notebooks together, which are used to analyze the model output. And so all of this creates a really low barrier for entry, so we can get sort of a new honours student coming along, within a few hours sitting down and running this global ocean model simulation, analysing all the output, being able to write up a paper, within a year time frame, which is pretty amazing. And I think the other thing that all of this together shows is that it really exemplifies the need for a national computational facility. So without having a shared place where we can run our simulations and store all our data together, there's no way that all these people from the different universities and CSIRO and Bureau of Meteorology would be able to come together to form these collaborations and work together like this. Okay, so just quickly, so the model that we've developed as this community together, as I mentioned before, is a 1/10 of a degree resolution. So we run it on Gaudi on around 12,000 CPU. For a 10-year model run, this takes us around 3 days of wall time, depending what we want to output, like this, about 1.5 MSU for those 10 years. And usually we sort of want to run multiple decades to do different perturbations, to see how the ocean circulation responds to different forcing. Okay, so this particular model, so it's really sparked a whole heap of collaboration and science that I think just would not have been possible if we were all working on our own individual model configurations, running our own clusters at our own universities. So we've really been able to come together, and people that might not have been able to develop their own model have been able to take output from simulations that other people have run and do science that way. It's also been taken up by CSIRO to submit to be part of the coupled client model for IPCC. It's being used by the Bureau of Meteorology for their ocean forecasting system. It's now being supported by Access NRI, which is a new national research infrastructure to develop climate models in Australia, and a whole heap of science. Okay, so that brings me on to talking about some science that I do with this model. Okay, so I'm going to talk a bit about, give you a bit of background about why the ocean is important for Antarctica, and then go through a few different examples of science projects that we've done with this model. So here we're seeing observations from satellite altimetry showing melt of Antarctica over the last couple of decades. So far, we're looking at sort of a centimetre or so of total melt, sea level equivalent melt from Antarctica. And this comes primarily from the West Antarctic sector so far. So this is quite small compared to the total sea level that we've had so far. There are other contributions which are more important, but over the long time scale, Antarctica potentially could contribute the most. There's 60 metres of sea level equivalent tied up in Antarctica, with about 3.5 metres in West Antarctica here. The Totten here is also starting to melt. is about another 3 meters, and there's another 1.5 meters in the Denman here, which looks like it might be starting to go as well. Okay, so the other thing about ice melt from Antarctica, so even though, again, at the moment, the contributions are relatively small, the uncertainties are huge. So this is looking at projections of sea level from all contributions, so including thermal expansion, Greenland, other glaciers. And so this is at 2,100 here. So the pink line shows a high emissions scenario. And this is the projection, which is sort of 0.6 to 1.1 meters by the end of the century. And so this is the Antarctic contribution to that, which is a small amount, but if you look at the uncertainty, the range of the Antarctic contribution, it's a very large fraction of the total uncertainty. And the same again as we go out further to 2,300. So there the Antarctic contributions potentially become much larger. And again, this shows the range of the Antarctic contribution, and it contributes most of the uncertainty of the total sea level. So if we can understand what drives Antarctic sea level and develop more precise projections of Antarctic sea level, that'll help a lot for protecting our coastlines in the future if we know more precisely how much sea level is going to be. Okay, so why are the oceans important for this? So Antarctica is melting entirely from underneath. So the atmosphere above Antarctica is pretty much cold the whole time. The ocean that comes underneath is relatively warm, so 2 degrees or so, which is more than enough to melt the ice. So this warm water comes up from the deep ocean, sort of from 1,000 meters depth or so out in the open ocean, up onto the continental slope, and circulates within these ice shelf cavities, and that's where the melting is occurring. If we look at ocean warming around Antarctica, so this is observations over the last few decades, we can see that the ocean is warming in the same locations as where that melt is occurring. But some of the big things that we don't understand yet, what are the mechanisms that are controlling this ocean warming, and how will the ocean temperature around Antarctica change into the future? Okay, so just a little bit about some of the dynamics, ocean dynamics around Antarctica. One of the main things that happens in the ocean around Antarctica is dense water is formed. So sea ice forms because there's a large heat loss to the atmosphere. When sea ice forms, it leaves behind the salt in the ocean. So this forms very dense water, which flows down and fills the whole bottom of the global ocean. So this dense water forms in these quite small scale linears here, where the winds blow the sea ice away from the coastline here, and then you're able to get heat loss from the ocean to the atmosphere once you clear the sea ice away. Okay, we also have warm intrusion, so this warm water comes up onto the shelf. Because of this slope here, there's no sort of time mean processes by which this warm water can get on, and so it all happens through sort of small scale canyons or eddies or variability tides, which are again difficult to model. So the dense water that flows down the slope, again, there are very small scale processes that are important to that circulation. So there's mixing of these plumes as they flow down the slope with the overlying waters above. Flowing around Antarctica, we have the Antarctic slope current, which follows the very steep, narrow slope around Antarctica. We also have these small-scale sea ice processes. So you can see these cracks and so on in the sea ice there. And so to give you an idea of how difficult some of these processes are to include in our models, so these red boxes that I've drawn on here, these are the size of a grid cell in the 1 degree typical IPCC climate model. And so we're pretty much not able to capture any of these processes in those types of models. Okay, luckily, when we go to our 1/10 degree global ocean simulation that I've talked a little bit about, we are able to start resolving some of these processes. So this is another lovely simulation developed by the NCI VisLab. And so most of, even sort of this resolution model that other people use around the world are not able to form this process of dense water forming around Antarctica. So what you're seeing here in the blue is the densest layer in the ocean that forms up on the continental shelf around Antarctica, and then flows down into the abyss. This is flowing north into the Atlantic Ocean here and fills the ocean abyss. There's some nice ones as we go around here to the Ross Sea, as we peel back this bit of ocean here. So we can see, yeah, here's the dense water being formed on the shelf, and you can see it flows down in these troughs here down into the abyss. Most global ocean models, instead of forming dense water up on the shelf like this, in these small-scale polynyas, will actually form it in these huge open ocean convection regions out in the deep ocean, where we get full-depth convection from the surface down to 3,000 or 4,000 meters or so, which is quite unrealistic. Okay, so what can we actually do with this model? So in this first project, we looked at how heat gets across the continental slope up towards Antarctica. So this is showing a plot of temperature around Antarctica, just in the time mean state. And so you can see there's these warm waters here in West Antarctica. This is even without climate change, and cold waters around most of the rest of Antarctica. And so because the waters here are much warmer, there's been this sort of long assumption in the field that there's a lot of heat transport by the ocean onto this region of the continental shelf here. And so we looked at this in our model, and what we found was that, so we have these particular regions where dense water is formed, as you saw in the movie just before, around Antarctica. And actually what we found is that the heat transport in the model occurs. So you get the dense water which flows down the bottom, and then the warm water comes on a bit above that in the water column. And this warm water is coming on in these same locations as where our dense water is flowing down off the continental shelf, localized to these same canyon features here. And so this is all well and good. So, we found this in the model. Is it actually real? Yeah. And so, actually one more thing I want to say there. So what that means is that so rather than the heat transport onto the continental shelf being the important factor for what sets temperature on the shelf, really the important thing for what sets temperature on the shelf is the combination of the heat transport onto the shelf and then what happens to that water once it's there. So does it quickly get vented to the atmosphere, or does it have a long residence time with that warm water staying on the shelf? So yeah, basically there's more factors we need to consider than just the heat transport. Yeah, and so then, yeah, this was quite fun. This study came out this year. And so they looked at observations, and they looked for this same process that we found in our modeling study, and found that they do actually find this in their observations. So I think this is a really nice example of, we can take our models, identify these processes, this dynamics that's happening in our models, and then this gives a direction for people with much sparser observations to go and look for these processes in the real world. Okay, another example of a study that we've done recently. So this is in collaboration with Crid Fraser at the University of Otago, who's a biologist. And so, again, it was in 2017, they found this kelp in Antarctica. So they found it here at King George Island on the tip of the peninsula. And this is quite unusual because kelp isn't found, it doesn't grow in Antarctica. And we didn't know of any cases where it had been found in Antarctica before. So kelp grows on these subantarctic islands, these triangles around here. And the biologists had long assumed that the kelp growing on these islands couldn't actually make it across the ocean circulation, the ocean currents, to get to Antarctica. And that's because, so the winds at the surface blow westerly like this, and because of the Coriolis force, that makes the surface waters have a northward component. And so anything at the surface drifts northwards away from Antarctica. And so this is the biologists thought that nothing growing here could ever make it to Antarctica. This is important for colonization reasons. So as Antarctica warms, can species from these more northern islands invade Antarctica and populate there? And so what we did was took our ocean models. So we took velocity output from our ocean models, combined with also output from surface wave models. So surface waves, due to the non-linearity of them, actually result in a movement at the surface. And so what we can see here is that, so the orange particles here are ones that get to Antarctica, and the blue ones are the ones that mostly drift north and don't get to Antarctica. And we found that when we included the combination of the eddying motion, so all this variability in the ocean circulation, plus the impact of these surface waves on these floating kelp particles, indeed, some of them could get to Antarctica. It's not common. We're talking sort of 1,000 particles out of 1 million or so. But in terms of what the biologists care about, it's enough. They only need one to get there, and then it can reproduce and colonize. This is just showing when we split up between not including different parts of the circulation, what happens. So we found that we need both the eddies and the waves in order to get the particles there. So this work has been extended a little recently by a PhD student at UNSW who's found that even if we release things from Australia or the northern continents, New Zealand, South America, we can also get connectivity to Antarctica there as well. Again, this South America one I think is quite interesting for the biologists because there are some overlaps here between the populations across South America and the peninsula. And people had thought it's because they're so close together. But really, if you look at what happens, all those particles do a full lap of Antarctica before they actually get to the peninsula there. Okay, so this... Yep. Okay, so this study was led by an honours student we had at ANU last year, Gemma Jeffrey, and she was looking at can you measure the bottom currents. So this is showing this movie here. It shows, let me just play that again. I can. No, okay. If we release like a passive dye tracer in our model near the coast of Antarctica here in one of the dense water formation sites, where that dye goes as it follows along the bottom of the ocean. So you can see these, the transport here heading out into the northern basins of the global ocean. And so she wanted to try and use satellites, so GRACE satellites, which measure really sensitive variations in gravity across the Earth's surface, to see if we could come up with a time series of the variability of this bottom ocean current. Because there's very little observations actually in the ocean. So in terms of measuring ocean circulation from ships that go out and put things in the ocean, ships only go out and measure across these lines about once a decade. And so there's no way we can get a time series of interannual variability from ships like that. And so what she did, she looked at, so we can relate how the density variations across this line here, if we know those density variations due to the variation in mass, we can then figure out the current due to the Coriolis force that goes northward like this. And so she used our ocean model to come up with a multiple linear regression to relate the transport in this basin to the ocean bottom pressure in the model. And she sort of simulated the noise of the GRACE satellite and the resolution of the GRACE satellite that you can see here to see what those effects had on the regression, on the fit that she got out. Did a lot of optimizing and ended up coming up with a time series, sort of a first time series of interannual variability from this GRACE satellite. The uncertainties are still very large, but I guess it's more of a test of the method of can you use these sorts of satellites to measure ocean circulation. I might skip this round very quickly. So this is just a recent study. Let's go quickly. There's been recent observations of warming. This is in the very deep ocean around Antarctica. So we did some forward simulations, forcing our model with future projections of the atmosphere. This came out recently this year, led by Qian Li, who was a postdoc at UNSW. And we found that this is the transport that goes in this deep circulation here all around the global ocean. And as we go forward in time, we get this really dramatic drop. Let's just stop there. But it's about a 40% drop by 2050 in this northward transport of the bottom waters, which is, super dramatic. Okay, so just looking forward now in terms of what's next in terms of ocean model development in Australia and internationally. So resolution is always a thing for us. So as we get bigger supercomputers, we can go towards higher resolution, and this enables us to include more and more processors. So we're really lucky with the recent expansion of Gardi. So we're currently running some 1/40th circumantarctic, 1/40th degree circumantarctic simulations. Unfortunately, I was about a week off showing you a movie from that, but that's really exciting on the horizon. The other thing that we can do as we have more computer power is ensemble runs, so to try and separate out the variability from the climate trends. If we run a whole bunch of different simulations starting from different initial conditions, that's very useful. Development of parameterizations. So increasingly people are using AI to develop better parameterizations, so for eddies and for mixing in the ocean. So we can train them on really high resolution model outputs to develop new equations or to optimize the parameters we have in the current equations that we have for our parameterizations. Currently, our ocean models are limited to running on CPUs, but there's a new ocean model called Oceananigans, which I encourage you to see Navid's talk on Friday about, which is written in Julia and can run on GPUs and gives about a 40 times speed improvement compared to the model that I've been talking about today. That's exciting. Including more processors, more complexity, so coupling with surface waves will give us better mixing in the surface ocean, coupling with ice sheets, so coupling with the Antarctic ice sheet to make sure we get a two-way interaction between melt coming from Antarctica and then how the ocean impacts that melt and then how the melt impacts the ocean circulation is really important. And also development of grids, so unstructured horizontal grids, and also development of vertical grids as well is something that we're all working on. And I will leave it there so we have time for afternoon tea.
Thank you for a really excellent talk. My thing is turbulence and this transition between two-dimensional turbulence with the inverse cascade and large eddies and three-dimensional turbulence with a Kolmogorov type style cascade to smaller things. How much does bathymetry, what you're talking about here, and how much, I know some of your eddies really aren't, they're sort of in between and the thickness of that layer. So what are the sort of, what do you see as longer term uncertainties, and which are the things that are going to really make the most difference to these eddies and transports, whether you get a giant eddy that just crosses the boundary and carries a whole heap of stuff at once, for example?
What's going to make a big difference? So I think in terms of, I guess what's shown here, so one problem that we have at the moment is we have this sort of numerical mixing, which really stuffs up the whole mixing that we have in the model. And this largely comes because we're advecting along these flat surfaces, flat layers in the model. So we're looking at developing better vertical coordinates that can more closely follow the density layers across which motion actually occurs in the ocean. Right. And I think the parameterization development, so I guess all of the small scale mixing that we have in models now and into the foreseeable future, decades into the future, will be done by parameterization still.
And so that vertical mixing will then affect things like solidity and all kinds of other parameters, which then affect your densities and your Atwood numbers. And
Yep. So the mixing in the ocean is very important. Like, it sets the density structure of the ocean, which then dictates where the ocean circulation goes, how much heat, how much carbon you can uptake into the ocean. It's critical. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Wonderful. Good. Thank you.
It's not computing related. Have you found plastic in Antarctica yet?
Yes, there has been plastic found in Antarctica. Yeah, so that's some of them.
Is it?
Yeah, some of the motivation as well for these, advection studies of particles from the northern continents to Antarctica is that, yep, there's definitely scope for that to occur. Yep. No, so so at the moment it's too cold for it to grow there, so there's still sea ice that rubs up against the coastline. So it was found sitting on a beach, and it was found to be reproductively viable as well. So potentially, as we're looking, 50 years into the future, when a lot of the sea ice melts back around Antarctica, particularly on that peninsula region, which is warming a lot, there's definitely potential for colonizations there into the future if we know that it can get there. Yeah.